Good morning, and welcome to First Baptist Church. Our sermon today is from John chapter 11, verses 1 through 6. And before we begin with our uh, message, we're going to read the text from John 11. And it says, "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, 'Lord, he whom you love is ill.' But when Jesus heard it, he said, 'This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.' Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was." And my sermon title this morning is "When God Seems Slow." We live in a world that hates waiting. Instead of waiting for a nicer meal, we're often quick and frantically moving around that we microwave our meals. Perhaps you've ordered packages from Amazon or Walmart or some other location, and because it didn't seem to arrive quick enough, you went on and tracked the package to see exactly when it was going to show up at your door. Or maybe you've had the experience of looking at a website where the web page takes longer than 3 seconds to load up, and you groan and get upset because it's taking too long. Waiting in our culture can feel like wasting. We talk about things like multitasking and getting things done, being productive. And so when we wait, our culture really makes us feel like it is us wasting time. But we need to realize that sometimes God doesn't move at our pace. And when he doesn't, what we find often is that we struggle to trust that he still cares. Maybe you've prayed for a breakthrough. Maybe it's healing from some sickness. Maybe you're praying for reconciliation from a relationship that you're dealing with. Maybe you're waiting for the next door to open for another job, another place to live, a move. But for whatever reason, heaven seems silent. And the minutes turn to days, the days to months. And you start to wonder, Lord, where are you? And if you have wondered this before, you are not alone. In fact, you're in good company. Many have felt that way over the course of history. But that's also exactly how Mary, Martha, and Lazarus must have felt when Jesus delayed. John chapter 11, verses 1 through 6 reminds us that God's delays are not his denials. They are divine designs meant to deepen our faith and reveal his glory. Now, Bethany was a small village about 2 miles east of Jerusalem. You can see it there on the map on the left in particular. And it was just over the location of the Mount of Olives. Now, there 3 siblings resided: Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Now, these 3 were dear friends of Jesus. And during the course of Jesus' ministry, on multiple occasions, this home was a refuge for Jesus. And so when Lazarus fell gravely ill, his sisters did the very thing they thought best. They sent word to Jesus saying, "Lord, the one you love is sick. Now, they didn't demand, they didn't manipulate, but they trusted that out of his love for their brother, Lazarus, that this alone would move Jesus to action, that he would hear and he would come, much like we would if we heard a loved one was ill. But the end of our text this morning has a kind of a surprise sentence. In fact, if you've never read this story before, or if you're unaware of it, it seems very peculiar. It says that Jesus stayed 2 more days where he was. Now, you would think, I suspect, that in most cases, if someone came and said, your brother, your father, your mother, your child is sick, gravely sick, and they could die at any time, it's imminent, that you would drop everything you were doing, get up and go. Especially if you, as Jesus, were capable of healing or changing the course of what the rest of that person's life would be. But there's something else at work. And often when we study Scripture, if we don't know things about what the historical context was, what the people in that day thought and believed, we miss not only aspects of the teaching, but sometimes, and in particular in this text, we can miss the main thrust of what God is trying to teach us and what Jesus' kind of mission and what he accomplished there, what purpose it primarily sold or primarily was. So what you need to know, if you don't know this already, is that in the Jewish culture, burial took place the same day as the death. So that's one major difference. Here, typically a person dies, and it could be several days, and in some cases, even longer, where people might wait. And if the body is cremated, especially, the ceremony might happen months later, but you're waiting for family to arrive and so forth, and the timing to be right. But in their culture, the burial took place the same day. And so the mourners would gather immediately, believing that the soul lingered in the body for 3 days or near the body. And so the thought was that with the soul being there, that there's a possibility of closeness, certainly closeness, but also of resurrection. And so after the 3 days were up, though, then the soul was believed to have departed the body, and therefore there was no chance of earthly recovery. Well, Jesus showed up on the 4th day. And so he enters the scene, no doubt, very sad, emotional. Maybe there was some anger and frustration that's not openly revealed here about the fact that had he come earlier, surely he could have made things outcome different. But we need to understand that Jesus' timing here was not random. He was trying to teach them a radical lesson. And that first point today is that sometimes God's love allows delays. So the sisters send word. They appeal primarily to the relationship Jesus developed with Lazarus. They don't send him word saying, we know that you're capable of healing Lazarus, our brother, even though they would have known this. No, instead they appeal simply because this is the one you love and he's sick, so come. Now, it's easy to assume that love always means quick intervention. Again, if you had a child or a sibling or a parent in this situation, it's natural to think the loving response is always quick intervention. But notice here that Jesus' love, which is not in question here, the sisters don't doubt that. They know it. But Jesus' love doesn't lead him to rush to Lazarus. In fact, his love does the opposite. It causes him to wait. Now, this is not a new pattern in Scripture. In fact, it's entirely seen in and throughout the Old Testament in particular. We know that God loved Abraham, and yet he made him wait decades before he got the son that was promised by God himself. God loved the nation of Israel, and yet he led them the long way through the wilderness. God loved Paul, and yet he allowed a thorn to be left in him. It's sort of like a parent who watches a child learn to walk. Now, the instinct, of course, when they start is for the parent to grab the child every time they start to wobble, to try to protect them. It seems like the loving thing to do. You don't want them, to, after all, to fall and hurt themselves. But the true love actually allows for them, within the proper context of a measure of safety, of course, to let them fall. Because the goal is growth, not comfort. And so just as the child learning that to fall is not the end of the world, but that it's part of the learning process and that brain connections are actually being made, that they're stretching the child. And in the same way, God's delays are a stretching ground of faith. So how does this matter to us? Why is this significant? Well, often we tend to equate God's apparent silence or delay with neglect. And we think if he's silent, then he's absent and he's not working, doesn't care. But we need to make sure we understand that God is working things in his timing. So take some time this week and process this question. When has God's weight in your life revealed more of his heart than an immediate yes would have? Sometimes, often even, we don't have the full scope of what's going on in terms of God's workings because all we can see is immediately in our context. We don't even often see how the things from the past tie in together with what we're experiencing today. And even less often, of course, are we able to perceive how what's happening today might directly impact things in the future. And so it's really often only by looking back where we might say, I'm thankful that God had me wait, rather than finding and giving me something that would have felt like the better yes right away. Now, I look back in my own life and my journeys into ministry, and there was quite a delay from when I was desiring to be and felt even called into ministry formally and to when I did. It was over a decade of time. And yet I look back and think God had a position and a place designed just for me. And that opportunity was placed and worked exactly how God wanted it to be. And so it would have been really easy for me in that time and for all of us when we're waiting to ask, why are you delaying? God, now is the time. I just lost my job and I need something else. Help me. And you don't hear an answer for a few days or weeks or months. It's like, why are you delaying? I just need you to give me direction, or who I'm supposed to marry, or where I'm going in life next, or why I'm lingering with some illness. Why the delay? And so we often end up looking back and realizing we live unsettled, unsatisfactory seasons of life because we're focused on why we delay. And we miss opportunities that we could glean from more easily if instead we started to ask and live under the idea of asking him, what is it that you're developing in me while I wait? Waiting is actually a good season to be in if you understand that he's using this as training grounds, as opportunities to prepare you for what's later. And this isn't easy. It's very difficult often. But what we need to realize that the delay that Jesus does here is not about timing, it's about testimony. He's actually orchestrating something far greater than a healing. He could have come right away and healed Lazarus, and it would have been great. It would have been a miracle. But he was setting the stage for something much larger, a resurrection. Secondly, God's purpose is bigger than our perspective. So Lazarus is sick, and Jesus hears about this, and this is what he says. This sickness will not end in death. And pause for a minute and think, okay, well, if you're Jesus and you can heal people, and the people around you that know you, that are close to you, know you have the power to, and you make that statement, then it probably only increases the presumption that the reason it won't end in death is because you're headed over there right away to heal it. And so it seems contradictory almost for him to just stay where he is in light of what he's just said. But there's something more at work. Now let's keep reading. He says, no, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. You see, from our standpoint, from a human standpoint, Lazarus' sickness and ultimately his death are a tragedy. But what we see Jesus revealing is that it was a platform for glory, for God, from heaven's viewpoint. Now, the word glory here means to reveal the true nature or worth of something in the Greek. In other words, what he's saying is Lazarus' illness was not meaningless. In fact, it was the very basis, the very means by which people would see that Jesus truly was the resurrection and the life. If you go into a jewelry shop, what you find is that any diamonds that are displayed are typically displayed with a black velvet cloth. And the reason this is done is because the brilliance of the jewel, the brilliance of the diamond is at its greatest. It stands out. And what we can take away from this analogy is that God sometimes allows darkness so that the light of his power comes through with full clarity. And so maybe some of you, maybe many of you are going through a hard time right now. And someone wiser than me once said, if you're not going through a trial now, it won't be long before you are. But as you're going through them, or if you are, remember this. If you're walking through something dark, it may be a backdrop that God is using to display his glory through your story. And so think about, where is it in your life that God could be positioning your pain to reveal his power? Again, maybe you're experiencing some trial right now. And so even to be able to shift and to say and pray, Lord, use this, whatever this trial is, for your glory. Lord, shine through my weakness so that you may be seen. That when people see what I'm enduring, they don't look at me, they look at you, because it almost seems like the way that we're dealing with it is supernatural. I remember a couple of men in my life in the past, both of which dealt with significant illnesses in their life. And both of them, for the most part, were able to speak in a way and to understand in a way that's like, this was not the greatest curse in their life. In fact, both of them would go on later to say that what they faced was one of the greatest blessings that God ever gave them. And it wasn't because they wanted it. They wouldn't have wished, in a sense, what they dealt with on anyone. But I think what they would have wished on all of them, on all people, would be that God would use the tools and the resources and the mechanisms that he will to help us to see who he is, to see our need for who Jesus is and what he does for us. Now, Jesus' delay makes maybe little sense to us at times, but it makes total divine sense. His love holds back because his purpose is higher. He's got something else in mind that we usually cannot perceive because we typically want comfort and a way out of trials when Jesus is trying to teach us so many things about who he is and who we are and our need for him. And one of the final truths that we need to understand is that God's timing, it's our third point today, God's timing is always perfect. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Again, if you don't know this story, you think, that makes no sense. Why, if he loved Lazarus and he heard he was sick, and of course we know he was gravely sick, why in the world would he stay where he was for 2 more days? We would expect the text to say Jesus heard this and immediately went to heal Lazarus, or it's certainly not how we would write this story. Jesus doesn't look like the hero at this point. In fact, he looks a little bit like the villain initially. But Jesus' delay was tied directly to his love. His timing was not neglect, it was a necessity for what purpose he had. Later in the chapter, what we're going to see is that had Jesus arrived sooner, Lazarus would have been healed, not raised from the dead. Now, healing would certainly have revealed Jesus' power, but not for the first time. He'd already performed a number of healings before this. But what it does reveal is his glory through resurrecting one who was dead. He was showing that his power was not limited by the grave or by death. Galatians 4:4 reminds us that when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son. Now, why is this text in here today? Why did I include it? It's really to point forward that when God sent Jesus into the world to begin, it came at, quote, the fullness of time. Meaning, God didn't send Jesus early. He didn't send him late. God never acts early, and he never acts late. He's always on time. And so if he feels like he's late, then that means, in a sense, we're rushing. And if it feels like he's too early, then that means we are slow in our, dragging our feet or whatever, however you want to say that. Additionally, how often do we find in our lives where we've got a plan and our plan doesn't go how we want and we're delayed, and all of a sudden panic sets in because we're realizing we're not going to get where we need to go on time. And so you start to try to rush faster. Those of you with kids understand this really well. Or maybe you're hindered by an obstacle you never saw coming. The other day I was preparing to drive to Litchfield, and I planned out just enough time to get there, and I was not hindered by panic. But I get to the train tracks, and there's a train parked on the tracks getting reloaded. And so that hindered. It was an obstacle that hindered. But God's not hindered by these obstacles. He knows everything. So think of it like this instead. Think of it like a symphony. Each instrument enters at just the right moment under the guiding of the composer. And to our ears, the waiting for certain sounds, or even when there's a rest, may feel like silence. But to the composer, it's preparation. So what does this mean for us today? It means that we are to trust that God's clock runs on kingdom time, not human time. Say that again. God's clock is on kingdom time, not ours. And trust that that's really what's best. It's easy to sit in here and say that. But then when we want something, how quick are we to want it now? We don't want it tomorrow. We want it now. Not in 30 minutes, but now. So what would change in your outlook if you truly believe that God's timing, even his delays, are perfect? How might that cause you to reevaluate your thinking of his work? And so if and when you find yourself impatient this week, remind yourself that his delay is not denial, it's divine design. And so as we wrap this up, let me just make one last observation. Mary and Martha couldn't see what was going on. They couldn't understand why Jesus would have not shown up as soon as he found out. In fact, no doubt the delay in some ways broke their hearts because they're watching their brother whom they love, whom they knew Jesus loved, and they knew Jesus could change the course of his future before he died, and he didn't show up. And then he dies. And then maybe the clock is clicking and they're thinking, okay, as long as he shows up by 3 days, maybe then. Well, then 3 days shows up, or the end of 3 days arrives, and he doesn't show up. And now they're into the 4th day. And so what they believe is that the soul of Lazarus has now departed and it's away, and now Jesus can do nothing. But that same delay in the end would actually strengthen their faith and bring the resurrection of their brother. God's seeming slowness is not him being careless. He doesn't set out to do something on Friday and get waylaid and not show up until Sunday. Rather, it is perfectly crafted. He sent Jesus into the world at the fullness of time. Every way that he acts, that God acts, is in perfect timing. And so when you face yourself waiting for God to move, remember that he might well be waiting for the perfect moment that his glory would be unmistakable, that your faith as a result would be unshakable, and your testimony would be undeniable. Amen.